2nd of September, 1942. Borg El Arab, Egypt. Two men walked out onto the Mediterranean beach dunes under the North African sun. Film director Geoffrey Barkas and artist Tony Ayrton had just been given an impossible task: hide hundreds of tanks, conceal thousands of tons of ammunition, make an entire armored corps vanish, then reappear where the enemy least expected it. They had 4 weeks. Failure would mean catastrophe at El Alamein. Success would change the course of the war. What they devised that afternoon became the blueprint for every deception unit that followed, including the American Ghost Army. But the British wrote the manual first.
Operation Bertram represented the most ambitious military deception ever attempted. Over 700 dummy tanks, 360 disguised field guns, and a phantom water pipeline stretching across the desert. All designed to convince Erwin Rommel that Montgomery's main attack would come from the south days later than planned. The techniques perfected in the Western Desert would eventually deceive 10 German divisions without a single shot fired. This was Britain's Ghost Army, and its methods remained classified for decades. The problem facing British Middle East Command in September 1942 was brutally simple.
The front line at El Alamein stretched only 30 miles from the Mediterranean to the impassable Qattara Depression. Rommel knew the attack must come somewhere along that narrow corridor. The coastal road in the north offered the only route for rapid advance. Any major offensive there seemed obvious, predictable, expected. Montgomery needed absolute surprise to break through the Afrika Korps. His chief of staff, Freddie de Gingen, summoned Barkas and Ayrton to headquarters with an unprecedented request: create the appearance of army units that didn't exist, simultaneously hide the real striking force in plain sight. No one had attempted deception on this scale before, not the Germans.
Not the Americans. The British would have to invent entirely new methods. Barkas had been recruited specifically for this moment. A film director before the war, he understood stagecraft, illusion, and the manipulation of perspective. The British Army had systematically recruited designers, architects, and artists for camouflage work, recognizing that creative minds solved problems conventional military training couldn't address. Barkas's deputy, Maxwell Ayrton's son Tony, brought painterly understanding of light and shadow. Brian Robb, rapidly promoted from private to staff lieutenant after Barkas noticed his talent, supervised the physical construction.
3 artistic minds collaborating on the largest film set ever built. Their audience would be German reconnaissance aircraft and Rommel himself. What made the British approach revolutionary was its integration of multiple deception disciplines. The physical camouflage worked in concert with Operation Canwell, a program of false radio traffic suggesting massive troop movements to the south. Double agents fed carefully crafted misinformation to German intelligence. Real engineering work began on defensive positions in the wrong location. Every element reinforced the central lie.
The attack would come late, from an unexpected direction, with forces Germany believed were still assembling far behind the lines. The technical solution Barkas proposed that September afternoon became known as the Sunshield. The concept originated from Commander-in-Chief Middle East, General Wavell, who had sketched a rough idea on a handwritten note in April 1941. But how could canvas and steel tubes transform a 28-ton tank into a seemingly harmless lorry? The first prototype, built by stage magician Jasper Maskelyne, failed spectacularly. Constructed from heavy wood, it required 12 men to lift and disintegrated on its first trial run over rough ground.
The concept, however, remained sound. A tank seen from 500 feet needed only to suggest the rectangular silhouette of a lorry. Perfect realism wasn't necessary. German photo interpreters viewing aerial reconnaissance images would see what they expected to see: trucks in a staging area. Nothing threatening, nothing urgent. The Mark II Sunshield solved every problem the prototype created. Canvas stretched over a light steel tube frame, hinged on both sides of the tank. 2 men could lift each half. The entire assembly fitted or removed in under 10 minutes, crucial for rapid deployment at night. Different models accommodated different tank types.
Crusaders, Valentines, Grants, and Shermans all received bespoke Sunshields mimicking various lorry configurations. From 500 feet altitude, RAF test pilots confirmed the deception held. The rectangular canvas canopy completely masked the distinctive turret profile. Tank tracks remained visible, but ambiguous in dusty conditions. Most importantly, the Sunshields created no new anomalies that might alert suspicious photo interpreters. Field guns presented a different challenge entirely. The distinctive shape of a 25-pounder gun and its limber, towed by the equally recognizable Morris C8 four-wheel drive tractor, nicknamed the Quad, advertised artillery presence across the desert.
Tony Ayrton and Brian Robb devised the cannibal technique. They positioned the limber's long towing pole to overlap the gun's trail, creating a single elongated shape. A simple box-like canvas canopy then covered both, with the real wheels of gun and limber visible beneath, exactly where lorry wheels should appear. The quad tractors received similar treatment, draped with netting over poles to suggest a standard truck profile. The realism of these disguises relied on careful attention to mundane details: wheel positions, shadow patterns, track marks made by bulldozers to simulate lorry movement.
British camoufleurs understood that German photo interpreters examined thousands of reconnaissance images daily. Fatigue and expectation bias worked in the Allies' favor. Analysts saw transport vehicles because transport vehicles belonged in rear assembly areas. Tanks belonged at the front. The geography of military logistics created its own expectations, and Bertram exploited them ruthlessly. 722 Sunshields were manufactured at the Middle East Command Camouflage Directorate workshops at Helwan, near Cairo. Each received a unique identifying number.
Tank crews traveled to the Martello holding area near El Imaid railway station, learned their designated parking position, and practiced fitting the Sunshield in darkness. Speed and silence determined success. On the night of October 21st, 2 nights before the actual attack, 722 tanks moved forward from their assembly areas to replace 722 lorries that had occupied Martello for weeks. Before dawn, every tank wore its Sunshield. German reconnaissance flights that morning photographed exactly what they had photographed for weeks: lorries, waiting, static.
If you're finding this deep dive into British deception operations interesting, subscribing helps the channel and ensures you don't miss the next one. Meanwhile, 722 dummy tanks appeared overnight in the original assembly areas far behind the lines. Constructed from plywood frames covered with painted canvas, these mock-ups cost virtually nothing to produce. 3 companies of pioneers from East Africa, Mauritius, and the Seychelles worked around the clock constructing the dummies. Palm fronds bent over wooden bed frames created surprisingly realistic tank shapes from altitude.
The turrets, fashioned from Hessian sacks stuffed with straw, even cast convincing shadows in the harsh desert sun. German photo interpreters noted the continued presence of armored units in rear areas. Montgomery's tanks remained days away from battle readiness, or so German intelligence reported to Rommel. The deception extended to every aspect of military preparation. 2,000 tons of petrol disappeared into stone-faced slit trenches, the fuel cans stacked in shadows where aerial cameras couldn't detect them. Over 100,000 4-gallon petrol tins simply vanished from German view. Food supplies in the northern sector received similar treatment, stacked and draped with camouflage netting to mimic lorry profiles. Sugar, cigarettes, and other desirable items went into the middle of stacks to reduce pilferage risk. The most audacious element, though, was Operation Diamond. The dummy water pipeline stretched across the southern desert at a meticulously calculated rate, 5 miles of visible pipe laid each day. Dummy pump houses,
overhead water tanks, even false filling stations complete with straw men posed as engineers. The pipeline's apparent completion date fell several days after the real attack date.
Montgomery wanted Rommel to believe the offensive couldn't possibly begin until the water supply reached forward positions. The pipeline never functioned. It didn't need to. It simply needed to suggest unreadiness. German intelligence calculated the attack couldn't commence before early November. They were wrong by 11 days. 3.5 dummy field artillery regiments appeared in the Munasib Depression to the south, carefully constructed to look seriously camouflaged, but progressively maintained with less care. German observers watched the mock guns deteriorate slightly day by day. Photo interpreters concluded they were observing decoys.
When the real battle commenced in the north on October 23rd, the dummy guns at Munasib were replaced overnight with real artillery, which remained completely motionless for 24 hours. An Axis tank attack, expecting no opposition, discovered massed guns opening fire at close range. The double bluff succeeded perfectly. The British approach differed fundamentally from the American Ghost Army that would form 2 years later. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, activated in January 1944, learned from British techniques, but operated on a smaller scale. American deceptions typically involved simulating 1 or 2 divisions with 1,100 personnel.
Operation Bertram deceived about an entire armored corps, over 600 vehicles, with a camouflage directorate staff of fewer than 100 officers and perhaps 300 pioneer troops for physical construction. The British integrated deception into the overall operational plan from conception. Bertram wasn't an add-on. Charles Richardson, implementing Dudley Clark's strategic vision, embedded camouflage into Montgomery's battle orders. Every movement, every communication, every visible preparation reinforced the central deception narrative. The Americans later added sonic deception.
Sound trucks mounting 500-watt speakers broadcast recordings of tank movements, bridge construction, and troop concentrations up to 15 miles away. The British relied more heavily on visual deception and false radio traffic, judging desert conditions unsuitable for reliable sonic effects. Open terrain and unpredictable wind patterns made sound projection unreliable. The approaches reflected different operational environments. Northwest Europe's closer terrain suited sonic deception. The Western desert's vast distances and clear visibility demanded primarily visual solutions.
When the Second Battle of El Alamein commenced on October 23, 1942, German commanders were caught completely unprepared. Rommel himself was on medical leave in Austria. His temporary replacement, General George Stumme, believed the attack weeks away. After capture, General Wilhelm Ritter von Thälme confirmed to Montgomery that German intelligence had credited the Allies with at least 1 additional armored division and expected the main thrust from the south. Bertram achieved total tactical surprise against one of Germany's finest commanders. Winston Churchill, announcing the victory to the House of Commons on October 11th, specifically praised the camouflage operation.
Montgomery's armored corps, Churchill noted, had moved silently in the night, whilst leaving exact simulacra of its tanks visible 50 miles behind the lines. Operation Fortitude, the deception campaign supporting D-Day, expanded Bertram's principles across the entire invasion front. Colonel David Strangeways, who had commanded Montgomery's R-Force deception staff in North Africa, planned much of Fortitude South. The fictional 1st United States Army Group, with General Patton as its visible commander, supposedly comprised 11 divisions preparing to invade at Pas-de-Calais. Inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, false radio networks, and double agents all reinforced the threat. German intelligence believed the deception. Hitler held 15 divisions in reserve at Calais for weeks after the Normandy landings, convinced the main invasion still approached. The scale of British deception work remained classified until decades after the war. Geoffrey Barkas published The Camouflage Story in 1952, but military authorities redacted sensitive details. The full extent of Dudley Clark's A-Force operations, coordinating strategic deception across the Mediterranean theater, emerged only gradually through historical research. The techniques themselves seemed almost absurdly simple: canvas and poles, painted plywood, radio transmitters broadcasting scripted conversations.
Yet these crude materials, expertly deployed, convinced German intelligence analysts and field commanders that entire phantom armies existed. Modern military deception doctrine traces directly to British innovations between 1940 and 1944, the integration of multiple deception channels, the exploitation of enemy intelligence collection methods, the understanding that small forces could credibly simulate much larger ones if every detail supported the narrative. Barkas, Ayrton, Robb, and their colleagues weren't soldiers in the conventional sense. They were artists who understood that warfare could be theater, that perception mattered more than reality,
That an enemy who believed a lie would act on that belief, creating exploitable opportunities. The legacy appears in unexpected places. The 722 shields represented a total investment of perhaps £50,000 in 1942 pounds, including design, manufacture, and deployment. The operation they enabled, breaking Axis power in North Africa and opening the path to Sicily and Italy, changed the war's trajectory. Not one shield fired a shot, not one dummy tank engaged the enemy. Yet their contribution to Allied victory measured equal to entire divisions of real armor, because they enabled those real divisions to achieve complete surprise. That remains the enduring lesson of Britain's Ghost Army.
The cleverest weapon isn't always the deadliest. Sometimes it's simply canvas and imagination, deployed by artists who understood that wars are won in the mind before they're won on the battlefield.